beautiful.
Good morning. How are you?
Oh my God. We feel so special. I mean, look how stunning you look at 6:25.
Thank you.
You woke up like this?
No,
You
I
know, he didn't tell me nothing. No, he didn't tell me nothing
He
like
didn't
that.
tell me anything like that this morning.
Because you
No,
all
no,
don't
no.
look
Nothing like that
beautiful.
this morning.
Because you all don't look beautiful. Such a pleasant change to the morning show. I finally have somebody who looks like me in the morning at this afternoon.
Oh, brother.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Mrs. Haynes Alleyne, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Haven't
Yes,
seen you
congrats.
since your nuptials.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I don't think so.
No, no.
How is
Yeah.
married life treating you? Minding your business and all that already?
That's all right. Nice. It's nice so far. Well, we've been together for quite some time, so some of but adjusting to being married, even the change in the name sometimes. I introduce myself as Anita Haynes still because right.
If you want to just put a ring on it, if you want to put a ring. Oh. Copyright strike.
No,
Congratulations.
never.
I
The
don't think
algorithm did not pick that up at all. It just was
Yeah.
It
confused.
didn't pick it up at all. It didn't
Yeah.
sound anything
Confused.
familiar. But you know what I was talking about.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
congrats
yes.
again to you. All right, a lot happening these days. The newspapers are carrying you in full this morning, indicating that, and let me quote you properly, that while you have supported your colleague Rushton Paray's call for internal elections, you also have shown that you are supporting the leader of the opposition, Mrs. Bissessar, in the position of party leader. Would that be
Well, yes. I mean, the question I think that we have to answer is what are we calling for, right? We're calling for internal elections. But until an election is called, you do have somebody in that position. And so the position requires the respect that it carries. And so Mrs. Bissessar is the political leader at this time and will obviously have my support in the position as political leader. But that does not prevent me from saying that elections must be called when elections are due. And we do have elections due by June of this year.
Is Natex election the same as leadership election, or are they different, or are they conjoined?
No, in the UNC's constitution, they are different. So the national executive elections must take place every 2 years, and the leadership election takes place every 3 years. However, for the last, I want to say 5 internal elections that we've had, 2015, 2017, 2020, 2022, so 4. The last 4 internal elections, they have been brought all together.
So is this probably part of the confusion? Because I think Rushton Paray's, in my opinion, said the same thing you said, but the response to him was vastly different. Is it because you're considered better looking than many? Oh, because he called for Natex elections to be held when they're due in June, I think. But the
Yes,
response to him by many of his colleagues was that this is not the time to attack the political leader. And he had to clarify he called for elections and Natex elections and didn't attack the political leader, Mrs. Bissessar. Why do you think there's a difference in response this way?
I really can't say. I mean, it was the response that also prompted me to come out publicly and say, listen, I really don't see what the issue is. I mean, up until yesterday, after I would have done the morning brew, and I would have seen releases still coming out. And so I think it is the response that caused the confusion because as far as I'm aware, and I watched Rushton's press conference, there was no attack. There was no line of attack. It was just simply saying, let us ensure that we have elections when they are due. And I think that now we're getting publicly from the leadership that the elections will be held. That was not part of the public discourse. It wasn't part of the internal discourse either before the press conference on Friday.
It's part of the response because some people in most political parties think this should have been an internally handled situation as opposed to a press conference demanding, and I'm putting, maybe he didn't use the word, that's not the word he would use, but to many it seemed like he was demanding the elections to be called. Who calls the elections?
The election has to be the Natex calls the elections. It's similar to the same way the prime minister will come, go to the president to dissolve parliament, so that the persons who have the leadership reins call the elections for leadership. As for it being an internal discussion, I mean, to some level, perhaps, but I have also been grappling with the question of speaking out publicly well before Rushton would have spoken on Friday, because I was part of the UNC's public meeting in Point of Air. I was on the platform, and the political leaders stated that the nominations will close and screening will begin. Nominations close for the United National Congress on April 11th, and screening to begin shortly thereafter, from April, well, I guess, within May, which strike concern with anybody, and that was a public pronouncement. It has been advertised on the UNC's platforms, etc. And
That
so
was
to
for the
me,
general election, right?
that is the general election, yes.
Yeah.
But to me, that is confusing because the national executive forms the screening committee. So if we are aware and intending to participate in our internal elections when they are constitutionally due, it would make no sense to convene screening before you convene these elections, because you don't know if that's going to be the same group of persons who will be doing the screening after an election.
I mean, what is logical, but is it that the UNC always holds elections when they're constitutionally due in terms of internal elections?
Mrs. Bissessar has held the elections at the appropriate time, save and except for the fact that she has joined the two elections. So rather than the leadership and Natex going separately, they run together. So that's the only difference in terms of what the Constitution stipulates.
Is it that some in the UNC, including the leader of the opposition, are construing these calls or interpreting these calls for Natex as some underlying intent to challenge her leadership? Hence the media furor, so to speak, that we're seeing playing out before.
Let me add to that, Richard, before Anita answers. Mrs. Bissessar is quoted as saying over the weekend that there are people whose aspirations outweigh their talents, almost seeming that was thrown at Rushton Parade, to add to Richard's question.
Well, I mean, it certainly appears that way. It appears as if, and like I said, the response to the call is really what has us here in this discussion, because simply, okay, there's a press conference to say we are looking forward to internal elections when they're constitutionally due. The response to me would have been, yes, they will be called when they're constitutionally due, but the end, full stop, right? So that, because again, there have been public pronouncements from the party over and over, we would have heard members of the current national executive, including the political leaders, state we are on an election footing, and we're going through with our again, all of these things I think they can all happen together, right? So we can be on an election footing, we can have an internal election justice and all. In my mind, the possibility exists where we can run an internal campaign, go to a portion of the electorate which are card-carrying members of the United National Congress, and state what your intention is, or what. So the intention of the current executive, if they all intend to run, the intention of persons who are aspiring to be on the executive, who believe that they have ideas and plans to create a UNC that is more attractive, an improved version of the United National Congress to take to the electorate in 2025 or whenever. And I think those things can be done, those issues can be ventilated. And once we set an example with how we conduct our internal elections, we set ourselves on a very good path for a general elections, because you've already reached out to your membership. Your membership is interested, mobilized, active, empowered, because they were able to vote internally, and they feel that they are part of our decision-making process. And then that sets the tone that you go on to meet undecided voters, persons who are dissatisfied with the state of governance overall in Trinidad and Tobago. And so to me, those things can all happen together. The question of whether or not it's being interpreted as an attack on the leadership, I mean, if it is that a call for election or a call for improvement makes you feel defensive, well, that is something that would require some internal introspection.
It's
Those
part
are
of
kind of
this.
those are kind of strong words, Anita, because you're basically saying check yourself, but in a sophisticated way.
Well, I mean, listen, that I can't, there is no other way I can conceptualize why have this type of response, you know? Uh, to me, it is part of a democracy. You must expect that in any space that you hold, that consideration must be given to saying to the members of the United National Congress, persons who would have filled out forms, paid their membership dues, etc., say this is what we intend to do differently so that we can have a different result in 2025. I think that ought not to be something that is unexpected.
Would you align yourself with a thought process that suggests that something that is seemingly innocuous as this call for an internal election to be held at the correct time, at the appropriate time, that has this kind of response is just a sign of fractures that may have been there in the party before?
I wouldn't call it fractures, right? I think that if any organization exists where every single person has the exact same thought, that is a weak organization. That and especially a political organization, what you want is a diversity of thought. You want the way so that the way we think, the way we put across our ideas, that they should be different and they should be come into some space and we come to a consensus and we present something to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Because if you have this kind of linear organization where there is one thought process and one idea and that's all that is recycled, you do not have something that you're offering the population. So I don't consider it a sign of a fractured organization. I consider it a sign of a dynamic organization and something that we should look into about how do we build it nationally so that we can understand that differing views aren't attacks. They aren't a space where we can't have a conversation about what is the best way forward, disagree at the beginning, but one persuades the other and we move forward. Because I mean that's the nature of life.
Well, then what does that say about the UNC at this stage in its incarnation? Because I can, one of the few ways I can characterize the response to Mr. Paray's call is he seemed to have been attacked over the weekend by people who did not appreciate him speaking out. There are even suggestions that, well, I wonder what happened to Anita now that she's supported the call by Mr. Parray, but also at the same time supported Mrs. Bissessar. So I guess your communication may have been a bit more even tone, but he was attacked when I saw people saying, including Mrs. Bissessar, aspirations outweigh talents. Dr. Monilal, MP for Princeton, Padirath, and others seem to have come out and say, listen to me, hush your mouth. We're talking now for we're supposed to be together and we're heading into election.
Mm-hmm. And you see, again, right, this idea of we are supposed to be together. In my mind, we are all together. Again, I looked at Mr. Paray's press conference on Friday, and I think he was also clear that we do have a duly elected political leader. So that is not within the conversation. But while you hold the position, any position, you ought not, I mean, if you have benefited from an election got you your position, you can't then now take that elected position and say there's no need for elections. You know, that is, to me, that does not take us where we need to be. And so that to have members who are currently on the national executive saying we must hold together, now is not the time. But you were elected. I mean, nothing stopped Keith Rowley from calling the election in 2022. Nothing, right? When we had the Natex election in June. If he woke up in the morning in May of 2022 and he said, you know what? General elections in September, there's nothing the United National Congress could have done. And we would have been fully in the swing of our internal elections. So I think those things they are being thrown in to create a conversation that I firmly believe has been unnecessary and uncalled for. And that is why I came out yesterday and back out today to say, listen, let us do better. We can perform the functions of our internal democracy while being ready for a general election. Two things can be true.
Have you gotten any personal pushback in terms of members of that same executive reaching out to you personally?
No, actually.
Is there some benchmark that was not reached that may have justified Rushton Paray's call at this time? Because you said your last missive was that, well, people who were elected should not resist an election. Was there some indication that an election was not going to be held that may have prompted Mr. Paray's call at this time? Is there a particular timeline involved that was not met?
No, we haven't met the timeline, but like I said, I think for those of us who are interested in seeing our internal processes handled in the manner they ought to be, the conversation around the creation of a screening committee, being well aware that the screening committee is created from the national executive, that it seemed to indicate that the narrative around the general elections would be used to say no internal elections. Because if you're going to have a screening committee that is comprised of an executive in May, knowing that that executive will expire in June, I mean, it would leave those of us who are thinking about it to assume that you didn't intend to call the election in June.
One of the newspapers is quoting you this morning as saying, well, I am prepared to stand by whatever consequences comes with me speaking out. Elaborate on that for us a bit, please.
The question I was answering a direct question I was posed, which is that persons who tend to speak out within our political landscape are removed from the political landscape. So I said, well, if that's the case, I'm prepared to stand by the consequences. And so if it is that the thinking of the persons who will be making decisions going forward into 2025, that having these types of conversations in some way destabilizing to a political organization, and then that if that is a consequence, well, then that is I mean, I don't think that I think that the consequences of silence far outweigh the consequences of speaking out.
And the screening committee will form from the present Natex in its present incarnation.
Well, again, from the public, from what we can only assume, because once you've closed nominations in April, and you said that you're going to go into the process of screening, then until you've called a national executive election, the only space that you can pull persons to screen from would be the current Natex.
Is there an insecure? Is this part of also, and there's no doubt that some political analysts suggest that Mrs. Persad Bissessar, this may be, and I don't want to use the term loosely, do or die for her politically. Dr. Rowley has won in 2015. Dr. Rowley has won in 2020. The UNC did gain a little ground in the local government election. But on a national scale, if Mrs. Persad Bissessar is not successful in 2025, it may spell the end of a political career. Is that part of the equation here?
That would be a difficult question for me to answer, because I'd be commenting on the thought process of somebody else. But I mean, look, for any political leader, it is the most important work is how you carry the party into elections. Mrs. Persad Bissessar has taken the United National Congress to a win in 2010. She held a coalition government in our space between 2010 to 2015. So none of these things ought to be diminished in this conversation. The successes that she would have brought to the party, having us between 18 and 19 seats, those things ought not to be minimized at any point in time. But, there is a certain amount of consideration to the fact that we have not held office since 2015. To me, that is not the doing of any one individual. It's certainly not just the political leader, but it does put us in a place, I think, to consider very carefully what we are offering the public in 2025 and to ensure that the results are different. And so, whatever the thinking is, Mrs. Persad, Bissessar, and I'll make it clear, once we've had an internal election, once you've committed to the democratic process within the United National Congress, and you've faced the electorate and you receive a mandate, people will go forward. But you can't say that these elections aren't required or that we're in the process of preparing for 2025 and that somehow our internal processes must be put in the back end of things when to me it is a sign of a growing democracy. It's a sign of what you offer the public if you can handle your internal affairs properly and then get ready for general elections.
Anita Haynes, I could listen to you and look at you all morning long.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I agree with you, Anita. It's important to speak out if you figure something is not right. I think that's what moves politics forward in a more transparent and progressive manner in Trinidad and Tobago.
In the
Other
ideal
times
world.
people are too silent.
I think the one thing you can say about me is that I have been consistent in my politics, right? If there are things, and since entering the political landscape, I have I have made sure that I am consistent with my politics. So if anybody would have been paying attention, you would know that I really would not have sat quietly and said, "Let us ignore democracy within our party for whatever political space we may be in 2024, 2025.
Clearly, your major is communication. It's showing. Thanks for being with us this morning. We always appreciate you with us, and congrats again on the nuptials and all the best.
Thank you. Have a good day.